Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo les va? Bueno, aquí estamos ya una vez más hoy nos quedamos con ganas de ver ¿cómo que se llama? El lanzamiento ay, qué cosa, se me fue la cabeza, estoy loco hoy. De SpaceX en Vandenberg. Paso a saludar a los miembros VIP y moderadores. Primero, Nico Lecuna dice: hola Dani, saludo a todos. Yo acá esperando el atardecer en el Monte San Pedro. Adrián Braga dice: muy buenas, ¿qué tal comunidad? ¿Qué tal maestro? Veo que la sagrada familia de los cortes, otra vez Scrub, llegará a despegar de los cohetes, decía Adrián, ahí veo la corrección. Joaquín Ferrero, y acá interrumpo y hay una muy buena pregunta. Joaquín Ferrero dice: ¿qué significa Scrub? Scrub, puso, se equivocó, que aparece en el título. En realidad, Scrub significa cancelar un lanzamiento cuando el cohete está en el sitio del lanzamiento, o sea, cuando está pronto y están haciendo la cuenta regresiva y viene todo armándose, y bueno, de alguna manera algo pasó mal, ¿no? Y bueno, cancelaron. Entonces, en inglés a eso se le llama scrub. No es una cancelación como cuando está en el hangar o está por ahí, no lo llevaron al sitio de lanzamiento y dice, bueno, cancelamos, lo vamos a hacer la semana próxima. No. Scrub es cuando hay una cancelación por razones técnicas o lo que sea, pero el cohete ya está pronto y están trabajando en el lanzamiento para poder lanzarlo. No hay un término que en español lo defina, por eso lo usamos. No es que seamos fanáticos del inglés, ni mucho menos, al revés. La idea es que todo el mundo entienda esto y está muy bueno. Sigo saludando. Ibiza Bambán dice: hola, saludos a todos. Rosa Sierra, que también saluda. Javier Parola. Javier Capochetti, desde Argentina, nos saluda, gracias. Bueno, aquí esperando una buena tertulia. En realidad, lo que tenemos hoy es una teleconferencia de la NASA. Vamos a poner un poquito el título. Aquí está. Está en el canal de NASA esto. NASA Video es el briefing de lo que viene pasando con ese test. En inglés se le llama el wet Dress Rehersal. No tiene tampoco una traducción exacta. En realidad en esto significa que es la prueba final antes del despegue. Es un ensayo general final con combustible. Por eso le llaman wet, mojado. Será porque los combustibles son líquidos, a pesar de que son gases transformados en líquidos y criogénicos. Puede ser por eso. En realidad indica de que el cohete están haciendo una cuenta terminal como si fueran a lanzar el cohete con todo, incluyendo el combustible, pero lo iban a cancelar 10 segundos antes. Esto viene complicado. ¿Por qué digo viene complicado? Porque en realidad viene con muchos atrasos. Es un cohete que vale más de 4.100 millones de dólares. Cuando fueron a hacer ahora esta prueba en el sitio de lanzamiento, en realidad esta es la tercera vez que les pasa algo. Todas cosas separadas y todas distintas. Decidieron no probar la etapa superior, o sea, ellos le llaman etapa intermedia criogénica, ICPS por las siglas en inglés. Decidieron no probarla porque había un problema también en una ola de hidrógeno y dicen, como esa etapa ya está probada, ya ha volado antes, probamos solo la parte de las cañerías hasta que llegan a la cápsula, a la tapa, y luego vamos a ver cómo seguimos. Bueno, en realidad cuando estaban cargando ayer los propelentes, empezaron a cargar el hidrógeno. La primera fase de carga es en carga lenta y cuando pasaron a la fase rápida, porque dejan que eso llegue a la temperatura, se aseguran todos bien, encontraron una fuga de hidrógeno, posiblemente en una válvula. Está fuera del cohete, pero tuvieron que cancelarlo. Vamos a ver qué nos dicen. Vamos a ver si ya empezó No, todavía no. Esa música es de NASA. Estamos en espera. En realidad esto, aclaro, no voy a traducir. Voy a escuchar. Estoy acreditado como prensa. Entonces voy a tratar de ¿Está mal escrito? Uy, lo escribí mal. Uy, Antonio. Bueno, ahora lo corregimos. La idea es las cosas más o menos interesantes que pasan o que digan, las voy a comentar. Ahora, de todas maneras, esta teleconferencia es solo con 2 personas. Es con la directora del lanzamiento, ¿no? que es hoy no ando del todo bien, Charlie Blackwell Thompson y Mike Serafin, que es el administrador, o sea, el gerente de misión Artemis.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for standing by. I would like to advise you that today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Tiffany Fairley. Thank you so much. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Tiffany Fairley with NASA's Office of Communications. NASA's third wet dress rehearsal attempt with a modified test procedure concluded yesterday, April 14th. The test focused on using the ground systems at Kennedy to load propellant into the Space Launch System's rocket core stage tanks with minimal propellant operations on the upper stage. The rocket remains in a safe configuration as teams assess next steps. Here to provide opening remarks and provide an update on the path forward for the Artemis 1 wet dress rehearsal are Mike Serafin, Artemis 1 Mission Manager, NASA Headquarters, Charlie Blackwell Thompson, Exploration Ground Systems, Artemis Launch Director, NASA Kennedy Space Center. And we'll also have questions available for Greg Horvath, Exploration Ground Systems Chief Engineer, NASA Kennedy Space Center.
Bueno, hay más gente hubo un cambio, hay más gente de la que estaba prevista.
We appreciate everybody's time to continue to follow the Artemis mission.
Este es Mike Serafin.
Since the last time we spoke, the team has done a tremendous job.
La última vez que hablamos, el equipo hizo un trabajo tremendo. Obtuvimos mucha información técnica de la primera vez, la segunda y la tercera vez que hicimos la prueba.
Prior to this third attempt that we had yesterday for the wet dress rehearsal, the mission management team met a day prior on Wednesday the 13th, and the focus of that discussion was primarily to resync the team headed into yesterday's test. Key topics of discussion included, closure of the actions and kind of updates on the procedural aspects of the wet dress rehearsal and what equipment inspections had been performed following the two prior attempts. Specific to the pad environmental control system and the fan outages that we had causing the scrub on attempt number 1, some updates to the cryogenic loading operations that we learned through attempt number 2, and then some procedural aspects to preclude another liquid hydrogen vent valve issue that caused us to scrub on attempt number 2 as well. Since that time, as you're aware, we had the issue with the interim propulsion stage, or the upper stage's gaseous helium vent valve, check valve, and we modified the wet dress rehearsal procedure for that. So there were a number of changes that we talked about headed into the attempt number 3. And at the end of that meeting, the day prior to the test, we pulled all the elements and all parties pulled go.
Hasta ahora hice un recuento de todo lo que han hecho en estos tres intentos de prueba final, de wet dress rehearsal.
And we had a very clean meeting. It took only about 25 minutes, and we had great support there from the range. The weather was great for the test, and the launch team and all of our support sites in Huntsville and Houston said they were ready to go. The rocket was ready, the spacecraft was ready, so we proceeded into the test. And during the wet dress attempt number 3, we encountered some issues with the cryogenic loading operations. Our launch director, Charlie, will walk you through that.
Bueno, dice que Charlie va a hablar ahora. Está llegando a la etapa, a la prueba 3, que empezaron hace 2 días. Y ayer se canceló.
Worked their way through the cryogenic loading operations.
Y tuvieron problemas con la carga criogénica.
Got further into the operation than we did on
creo que en el enfriado de las cañerías, ¿no?
And gain new technical knowledge and new technical information to prepare us for flight. We encountered a liquid hydrogen leak, or an LH2 leak on the tail service mast unit. The tail service mast unit on the LH2 side sits on the deck, the zero deck of the mobile launcher, and it's about 30 feet tall. And there's an umbilical plate that is on the ground side that provides the cryogenic fuel, in this case the hydrogen, from the cryosphere.
La unidad donde está la falla está en el nivel 0 del vehículo lanzador móvil conectado a tierra.
With the Space Launch System rocket to fuel the core stage. And it was on the ground side of that umbilical plate that we saw the hydrogen leak.
La pérdida está del lado de tierra de la unidad esa en el nivel 0.
You have hydrogen leaks and
de hidrógeno, una pérdida de hidrógeno.
Ignition source to close the fire triangle, so it was a flammability risk. And,
lo que sí sé es que, esto nos lo está diciendo Sarafín, es que los sensores, los detectores de hidrógeno para detectar pérdidas, detectan a nivel molecular. O sea que, si la pérdida es mínima y el hidrógeno es muy finito, o sea, pasa prácticamente por cualquier lado.
To roll up all the information we obtained through the test, and we talked about the art of the possible moving forward.
Y obviamente no lo está diciendo,
el hidrógeno es we're not ready to say exactly what the option is. It's been less than 24 hours since then, and folks had a pretty long day yesterday. I'm sure our launch director probably had the longest day because she got up before us to prep for the tanking meeting, and then worked all the way through the day and was there with us at the end of the day when we had our post-scrub MMT meeting. But we've got a couple of options in front of us. We are preserving the option to reattempt a wet dress as early as next week.
Bueno, la semana que viene, ya lo dijo, van a intentar de nuevo la semana que viene hacer un cuarto intento de wet rehearsal, de ensayo.
That are going to be over on Launch Complex 39A are setting up for a launch attempt on the 23rd to launch Crew 4.
El 23 van a lanzar SpaceX, así que lo van a coordinar con ellos.
In our commercial crew and commercial LEO friends, and we're going to stay
inclusive habían atrasado el lanzamiento
that's pretty much my opening comments on our
la Crew 4
trial loading and our readiness. But as was said earlier, the mega moon rocket is fine. All the issues that we're encountering, I would say,
lunar
again,
está bien, dice, está
seguro, and lessons learned, with the exception of this ground umbilical plate that we've got to go figure out where the leak is, and we've got a couple of options that we're looking at there. So with that,
estamos mirando un par de opciones que tenemos ahí revisando. Bueno, a ver, Charlie va a hablar ahora. La directora del lanzamiento.
Thompson here, Artemis Launch Director. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time today. I want to start off by saying that I'm really proud of the work that our team has accomplished and that we continue to do as we get through wet dress rehearsal. Yesterday and throughout the course of the countdown, which started on Tuesday afternoon, we continue to listen to the hardware. We continue to learn as part of this process,
seguimos aprendiendo de todo este proceso. Y es cierto, digo, es la primera vez que van a lanzar este cohete, este tipo de cohete, y toda la gente involucrada está aprendiendo a cómo hacer la previa, obviamente, o sea, la preparación para el lanzamiento.
And getting us ready for tanking. And as Mike described, we got into our tanking brief yesterday morning. I had to think about that for a second. Got into our tanking brief yesterday morning, and really we were all systems go. We did experience an outage of gaseous nitrogen from the off-site supplier just as we were getting ready to begin our tanking operations, and so that set us back a little bit in our propellant loading timeline. Once we reestablished the supply of the GN2, our team started the operations to load liquid oxygen into the rocket's core stage. While loading liquid oxygen, or LOX, as we like to call it, the teams
Para escuchar ahora un ruido es que voy a loguearme para hacer preguntas.
After the tone, please state your name.
Daniel Regueira.
Thank you.
Into work, and we got right into our
si no lo digo así no lo entienden.
On the LO2 side of things. So shortly after we got into that operation, we began to look at the hydrogen side of the interface. We had been very anxious to load hydrogen. As folks know, the hydrogen molecularly is very small, and at cryogenic temperatures, sometimes in the beginning stages of loading is when you will see a leak. We got through our slow fill operations. Everything was nominal, had no issues. And when we transitioned to fast fill, which you will see an increase in pressure as part of that loading operations, we did detect a leak on the tail service mast on something that we call the purge can, or the purge canister. It's actually on the back of the ground side plate, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the questions, but we did see a leak there. We had a couple of different contingency scenarios or contingency plans that we can put into place or utilize, and we did that, but it did not resolve the leak. So we went ahead and safed that operation, got into our stop flow and into a revert, and decided that we would move on to the upper stage chill down operations as we had described in our previous press conference. We did that. Everything worked pretty much as expected.
Bueno, Charlie estuvo contando lo que pasó el día de ayer, ¿no? Que es interesante, en realidad dice que encontraron esa pérdida de hidrógeno, mandaron personal, no pudieron repararlo, o sea, no pudieron solucionarlo, y dijeron, bueno, suspendemos esta parte y ahora seguimos con la prueba criogénica de lo que es la etapa superior, la ICPS, porque ya dijeron que iban a hacer esa prueba.
We did first motion checks. We had our booster DFI checkout as well. We did our commanding with the Johnson Space Center. Our Dolly operations were all worked. We did our tanking outer mold line scans. Those were completed. We did some of our guidance and navigation checkout, the Orion comm system checkout, and we were also able to demonstrate a number of our contingency procedures. So while we did not get all the way through the planned activities, we certainly accomplished quite a bit. So after working through that, and as I said, getting down to the T-minus 10-minute hold, we decided to end the day as Mike described, knowing that we would not be getting into the terminal portion of count. Again, the teams did an excellent job in accomplishing the objectives as briefed, and so we really saw very good performance across the flight systems, and again on those things that on those activities that we accomplished, we didn't have any significant issues besides.
Rosa pregunta, dice, de alguna manera lo van a hacer, aunque tarde un poco más. ¿Qué opinas tú? Sí, definitivamente esto sigue adelante. Aparte están construyendo el cohete 2 para el año próximo y para el otro. Y el gobierno acaba de votar un nuevo dinero para eso también, ¿no? Tienen el presupuesto, tienen la gente, están los cohetes, esto se va a lanzar, que no quepa duda. Quizás en algún momento se cancela después de la misión 3, pero por ahora la 1, 2 y 3 siguen adelante. Hay que ver cómo dentro de 3 años, cómo está posicionado el Starship. Está hablando de la placa de al lado de tierra donde está la pérdida.
And so we'll go, what we're setting up to do now is we're getting access. We have access stands in the VAB. We currently have those, they're at the pad. We had them taken from the VAB to the pad this morning. And once we get the mobile launcher zero deck configured, we'll lift those up.
De todas maneras, hay un tema. No hay que descartar lo increíble que es el desarrollo de este mega cohete. Por más de atrasos, por todo el dinero que lleva, pero es algo brutal de gigante. Quizás enfocado con una óptica totalmente distinta de lo que está haciendo SpaceX con su Starship, pero no deja de ser extremadamente complejo, y la cantidad de centros de control y la operativa que involucra
Thank you so much, Charlie. We'll now begin with the question and answer portion. Please remember to stick to one question and identify to whom it is directed. If we have time, we'll allow reporters to ask a second question. You can enter *1 on your phone to be entered into the queue at any time, and you can enter *2 if you'd like to be removed from the queue. Your phones are now on mute, and the operator will open your mic when we're ready and close your mic after you've asked your question. Again, we ask you please stick to one question. Shortly after we conclude, you can listen to a replay of this teleconference online. And we'll go ahead and begin with Marcia Dunn with Associated Press.
Marcia Dunn,
Yes,
Associated
hi, for Mike.
Press.
I'm just wondering if one of the options under consideration is, given that there is a launch coming up on the pad right nearby, just going right back to the VAB, replacing the valve in the upper stage, taking care of any other issues, and then going back to the pad. Is that under consideration at all at this
Algo
point?
parecido le iba a
And
preguntar
if
yo,
you
así que
do
si tienen alguna otra pregunta es mejor que
top to
me la pongan
bottom
en el chat.
wet dress rehearsal, how much extra time in processing would that be? Thanks.
Yeah, Marsha, I'll take the first part of that question. Charlie probably has a better sense of the timeline, but in terms of what the troubleshooting plan is, we're kind of breaking it down into a series of kind of low-hanging fruit options, things that are readily accessible.
O sea, la pregunta fue si no podían llevar el cohete de nuevo al edificio de integración, reparar esa válvula que está mal en la etapa superior, volverlo al sitio de lanzamiento y seguir hacer la prueba completa.
And then there are a couple of more invasive options, and we've got to weigh those against a whole host of considerations that include, putting additional just wind stress on the vehicle. The longer we stay at the pad, the more we stress the vehicle. It's 32 stories tall. Every time the wind blows against it, it creates a bending moment, and over time that adds up. We got to weigh that against environmental exposure out in the field, but then also the rollback to the vehicle assembly building. To reattempt a wet dress rehearsal actually puts stress on the vehicle as well. So we've got a series of actions that we've asked the team to go off and provide data back based on the core stages experience, going all the way back to the Stennis Space Center and the Green Run hot fire test and the stresses that we saw it go under not only there in the test stand, but also during transportation and some of the activities here at the Cape. We've got a whole host of other constraints that we're looking at as it pertains to interfaces with the spacecraft, and we're going to weigh all those, and we've got kind of what I call a bucket of considerations that we need to all bring to the table. And we talked about what those were last night in the post-scrub mission management team meeting. And I think once we get a better understanding of what all the considerations are, I'll be able to better answer your question.
Bueno, no se lo dijo. Dice que el movimiento, como bien escribió Marco, de recorrer Uruguay, significa mucho estrés para el cohete. El movimiento hacia un lado o hacia otro. Habló muchísimo, dijo un montón de cosas como las que tuvo expuesto el medioambiental, los combustibles, etc. Pero en definitiva dijo, lo vamos a evaluar. Lo estamos evaluando con el equipo, es una de las cosas que hemos conversado, dice, pero no puedo responderte ahora.
But there are different options that could be in play there. I mean, you could certainly look at your schedule risk for launch countdown, and you could make a decision of whether or not you wanted to do a tanking prior to a launch countdown. I mean, we have a certain number of days that we can be at the pad before we begin to bump up against our range requirements. And so you could make a strategic decision to go utilize one of those for a wet dress or a tanking and do that, and then some days later decide to go launch. So I think it really depends on the scenario from, your rollback to your first, if you were doing a tanking test, a wet dress, or a launch.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Bill Harwood with CBS News.
CBS, a ver qué pregunta.
Thank you very much. This is for either one of you, I guess, but can you develop rationale to fly without ever doing the ICPS in a test? And I'm asking that because most of the problems you guys have been on the ground side versus the rocket side, but there have been issues.
La
all
cantidad
the
de
way
problemas
through.
que la mayoría de los
I'm
problemas
just
que están
wondering, could you
teniendo
get to
está
a point where you could actually launch the
en la
rocket
torre, o
without
sea,
ever
en el vehículo
fueling the ICPS? That's my
no en
question.
el cohete.
Bill, fundamentally
¿Cuál es
it
la
comes
pregunta?
down to risk acceptance and what we consider to be an acceptable level of risk. So I do believe that there is a path forward, provided that we understand what the risk is. It would include a whole host of considerations, including the Delta IV Heavy flight history and the Delta Cryo second stage, and the history of this particular flight element, and what data we've obtained through the testing to date, that some of which is at the pad, some of it is in the vehicle assembly building, and some of it was done before the interim propulsion stage ever arrived at the Kennedy Space Center. And we would have to weigh all that and understand the risk, and either agree to accept that risk or decide what the Delta work would be to get to an acceptable level of risk.
Bueno,
We are not done with our
está hablando que una vez que lleguen de vuelta con
and
el
we're not
cohete
ready
al
to make that
edificio de
determination.
ensamblaje, ahí van a revisar justamente todo y van a ver cuáles son los riesgos que involucrarían utilizar el vehículo así sin la carga total, y lo van a sopesar con todo el resto.
If we were to make that decision, and I know that that's still ahead, there are launch commit criteria.
Emanuel, sí hay un problema de válvulas en la etapa superior, en lo que es la ICPS, que dijeron que no lo pueden solucionar ahora, que lo tienen que hacer en el edificio de integración, y por eso la prueba esta de que cancelaron el día de ayer no incluía las pruebas en esa etapa superior.
In place, and the launch commit criteria is probably the single best example of that.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Irene Klotz with Aviation Week.
Aviation Week, pregunta.
Thanks. Good afternoon.
Irene Clark.
Probably this is for Charlie. The hydrogen leak signature, was it gradual or was there a sudden
La pérdida
increase
de hidrógeno, ¿se fue gradual o fue algo que
could you
empezó
describe
de
a little
golpe?
bit
Sí.
about what data you can get without doing a tanking that will let the team know that the leak has been found? Thanks.
Yep, I can absolutely speak to that. And one thing I probably should have clarified when I was making my opening remarks is that in the cavity itself, between the flight plate and the ground plate, we did not see a leak. We actually saw this really on the back side of the plate. And so
no vimos la pérdida del lado adentro, del lugar donde están esas olas, sino del lado afuera.
And what we saw is that as soon as we went to into fast fill, we saw the leak go up pretty quickly. It wasn't a gradual leak. We saw it spike up.
Esa pérdida apareció muy rápido.
See my hands here, Irene, but what happens is around the backside of that plate, there's like a purge shroud, and it's a fairly small enclosure. And so any amount of leakage in that enclosure, when you've got a sample line in there that's pulling that and looking at that concentration, I mean, it's a small volume, and so any amount of leak is going to send your concentration up pretty quickly, and that's what we saw.
Claro, una pequeña pérdida igual en el lugar donde estaba eso, dice que es un lugar relativamente, o sea que es un lugar cerrado, dice se llena, es un gas, el gas ocupa el espacio disponible siempre.
During the test operations, and in terms of the path forward, and I'm going to pull Greg in here too because he's our chief engineer for the ground systems. In terms of the path forward and what we can do, there's a number of things that we believe that once we get access, we can go take a look at. As I described, there's a number of discrete penetrations into this area, and so the first thing is you want to go check those. And do you have anything that's loose or obvious?
Ahí tiene una pregunta.
There's also some ambient leak checks that we can go do on the system.
Una pregunta interesante. Escríbanla en el chat y la consideramos para preguntar cuando llegue el momento.
That we can do. This area is typically purged with helium. You know, we could change the purge in there and run some helium through some of these other areas and use some of our HAZ gas detection equipment to go see where we're seeing leaks from. So we have a couple of tools that we can go that'll help us evaluate this particular area and these particular penetrations and figure out which one's really causing us the issue. Greg, anything to add on that?
You covered it mostly, Charlie. Yes. So on the back side of that ground plate, we'll call it, there is a purge can. It's a two-piece metal can that we bolt together. Within that can, we have several penetrations into the fill line and the bleed line. We don't think the bleed line's an issue because we weren't flowing through it. There was no pressure on it. And the signature of the leak happened when we transitioned to fast fill. We rapidly increased pressure in that line. The penetrations into the line, there's three of those on the fill line, and then we have a flange connection which has two gaskets with a debris plate between them. That's a bolted flange on the 8-inch line. That's another potential leak point as well. So like Charlie said, we do have access to that area at the pad with the access stands. Once we take that purge can off, we'll have ability to do a leak check. Now, ambient leak check is not the same as a cryogenic leak check at -423. So, a lot of times when we do leak checks, we don't see a leak at ambient, and then you get the cryogenic temperatures, and it does leak. So we're hoping to see something obvious with one of those penetrations into the line, and then we'll go from there as we get the data.
Up next, we'll have Eric Berger with Ars Technica.
Eric Berger de Ars.
Hi, thank you very much for doing this. I've got a couple questions. First for Mike, I think, is there a scenario in which you would actually launch the mission without completing a core stage wet dress test? I mean, you talked a lot about sort of the potential wear and tear on the vehicle and systems being out at the pad. And I'm just wondering if you'd get to a point where you would, you would go without doing a wet dress test through terminal count. And then for Charlie, I think, can you tell me how long it's going to take to launch? How long you have to launch or roll back to VAB once the flight termination system is armed? I think I've heard something like 3 weeks, but I'd love a clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, Eric. So on the core stage, one of the, I would say, the primary objective of the wet dress rehearsal is to demonstrate the ability of the ground systems to perform these cryogenic operations with the core stage, and excuse me, our ability to demonstrate both of these commodities under flight-like conditions or ground test conditions is what we're really after here. And we have a very large vehicle, and we're flowing a lot of commodity, and we've got some really complex physics going on. I would argue they're PhD level physics.
Gracias, Marco, por esa traducción ahí en el chat. Dice, la pregunta es si toda esta prueba incompleta va a continuar dilatando el lanzamiento y en cuánto tiempo. Decía.
Something that we need to go off and get enough data to show that we these operations under the conditions that we will need on day of launch. That said,
Walter Batista, sí, la respuesta es sí. Después que finalicen el wet dress rehearsal, o sea, el ensayo, lo llevan al VAB, solucionan todo lo que queda pendiente y teóricamente quedaría para el lanzamiento.
And we'll just have to see, what residual risk there is there. I wouldn't say that that's something that is really in the forefront of our mind right now, but it's something that that we could consider moving forward. I just don't see that right now as our primary objective. Our primary objective is really getting past this leak and getting into a wet dress. And Charlie, I don't know if you want to handle the time to launch question.
Yeah, so we do have, I believe what you're referring to is we do have a requirement for the range for the flight safety system, and we do have a timeline associated with that, and that's 20 days.
Next, we'll have Andrea Leinfelder with Houston Chronicle.
Hi. I would like to put this wet dress rehearsal into a bit of perspective. I'm not sure if this is a question for either of you, but I'm curious how it compares with wet dress rehearsals for the Space Shuttle and the Saturn V rocket. like if you can describe how long those tests took and what type of issues were discovered.
La pregunta dice, no sé si es para ustedes, dice,
Thank
¿cómo
you.
lo comparan ustedes con los ensayos que han hecho en los lanzamientos anteriores del transbordador espacial?
So let's see,
Fueron
I'll take a
meses,
shot at this.
meses
Greg,
fueron
if
para el
you
primer
need
lanzamiento.
info, feel free to jump in here. So I have the honor of working with one of the engineers. He's actually on our cryo propulsion team that was around for STS-1. And so we were just talking about this.
Tuve el honor, dice Charlie, de trabajar con uno de los ingenieros en ese team.
Ready. I think the number was somewhere in the 5 to 6 prior to launch for STS-1. And so if you look at that in the context of kind of where we are, again, shuttle was a single stage vehicle. We're trying to load 2 stages, so you gotta get the core stage and upper stage. There are some complexities with that load compared to shuttle, and so I would say putting it in context.
El shuttle era un vehículo de una sola etapa, dice, acá hay muchas más complejidades.
First time ops is how I would characterize it, but Greg or Mike, if you want to offer.
Yeah, Andrea, I would say we occasionally get to talk with some graybeards that are around from shuttle or the Apollo Saturn time frame, and they will tell us that, you know, these systems are incredibly hard to characterize. You've got complex physics going on. You've got fluid dynamics. You've got thermodynamics. You've got flammability hazards, you've got cryogenic temperatures and structural stresses you're putting on it, not only from the weight of the propellant, but also the structural
Emanuel, muy buena pregunta, pero no es para esta gente, eso es una pregunta para el poder político o quien administra la FAA, la NASA. Para Bill Nelson, el administrador, el ex senador, que fue uno de los que inclusive propició los fondos para iniciar esta misión. Los dos principales que están en esta teleconferencia son la directora de lanzamiento y quien está hablando, que es Mike Serafin, que es el gerente del programa Artemis. Y esa pregunta está muy buena, pero es para un nivel superior.
Much more advanced engineering models and techniques, and the ability to build precise pressure vessels using state-of-the-art welding techniques.
Este vehículo no se trata de unizar. Este vehículo ahora se trata de orbitar la Luna y volver nada más. O sea que en realidad es la carga de pago, es la cápsula nada más que va encima de todo. El resto de todo es carga.
Next, we'll have Jeff Faust with Space News.
Good afternoon. A question for Mike Serafin. You mentioned in your opening remarks you were looking at a couple of options, one of which was to try the wet dress again as soon as the 21st. Apologies if I missed it earlier, but what other specific options are you looking at right now in addition to trying the wet dress later next week? Thanks.
Yeah, so, the options are, again, it's really what are the low-hanging fruit options, things that are relatively straightforward, easy, obvious, that need to just be adjusted on this purge canister, the penetrations that maybe there's an obvious leak source and to basically rectify that. There are some more invasive options that require getting further into the hardware and potentially having to get into some extended troubleshooting, and then where is the most appropriate location to conduct that. I would say that's kind of the spectrum of what we're looking at, but there are other constraints and considerations that we're looking at that have to do with the pad environment, or if we were to choose to not do this work out at the pad, what we would be giving up or gaining in that case. So there's again a number of considerations there. I don't want to get in front of those decisions. We're not ready to make that decision. We haven't fully outlined all the options right now. The one that we're pursuing, I would say, with great vigor is the low-hanging fruit option. And we'll let the team kind of come up with some other options here. Again, it's been less than 24 hours since we ran into this problem.
Next, we'll have Ramin Skiba with Wired Magazine.
Wired Magazine, pregunta ahora.
Hi, thank you. This is, I guess, a question for both of you. I just wanted to follow up on an question. Would you say that, considering the complex physics involved and how these are in many ways new pieces of hardware, and there's a lot at stake with this rocket, are you still very confident about continuing or finishing the wet dress rehearsal test on the launch pad and hopefully launching in the next few months? Like how confident do you feel about the process at this point?
¿Qué tan confiados se sienten en el proceso para poder lanzar en los próximos meses?
The vehicle has performed really well. We really, the only thing we're seeing on the flight side is this check valve on the upper stage. That is a relatively straightforward thing to go off and resolve.
El único problema que hemos encontrado hasta ahora en el cohete es esa válvula de chequeo en la etapa superior.
Procedural or slight adjustments in the operation or the limit sets or some of the software triggers. Those are things that are relatively straightforward to go off and do. You just need a little bit of time to work through them and confirm that you're staying within the system constraints. And then this hydrogen leak, and that's on the ground side. So, I'm confident we're going to get there. If you want an exact date, I can't give that to you right now. It's really just we will be ready when we get through the test program. And we are, I can promise you, we are working hard to get through it. We are putting in some long hours to do it, and we will let you know when we know when we're going to set up for a launch attempt. I don't know, Charlie, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I certainly have some thoughts on it. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that we will finish this test campaign. And that we will listen to the hardware and the
no tengo dudas, dice Charlie, de que vamos a finalizar esta etapa de pruebas
en la que estamos. Launch this vehicle. As Mike said, I don't know exactly what that date is, but there's no doubt in my mind that we'll finish the test campaign and we will be ready to go fly.
Dice, y vamos a estar prontos para lanzar, dice Charlie.
Thanks so much, and we'll have time for a final question, and that'll be Micah Maidenberg with Wall Street Journal.
Bueno. Tampoco, no nos tocó. Me tocó a mí.
Hi there. I think
Última
this is a
pregunta.
message for Charlie. Could you remind us which contractor was responsible for the umbilical where the leak appeared and what sorts of communication, if any, you've had with...
¿Qué proveedor es el que el de las partes umbilicales que ha fallado? Dice, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el proveedor de eso?
And so let's see, it is our ground hardware on the ground side of the interface where we saw this particular leak. In terms of the manufacturer of that, I'll have to get back with you on that unless Greg, you have information.
No, dice, esto es en la parte de tierra del equipo, dice, te lo vamos a hacer saber en la brevedad.
Thank you all for joining us today. You can listen to a replay of this teleconference online by visiting the Media Resources tab at www.nasa.gov.
Nada nuevo, las preguntas en realidad ya vemos que fueron un poco en el estilo que la NASA espera de esos medios. Qué lástima no tuvimos oportunidad de preguntar, porque en realidad la pregunta nuestra creo que estaba interesante. Bueno, no se la voy a decir, por lo menos aquí. Reconfundido estoy, mil disculpas, dice Gerardo Portilla. Pregunta para Daniel, ¿este lanzamiento podrán tener imágenes de restos que hayan quedado en la única expedición de la Luna? Bueno, podría llegar a ser, sí, cómo no. Pero, recuerden, voy a colgar la llamada. Ahí está colgada. Recuerden que esta nave, o sea, la cápsula que está, la Orión, que está encima de este cohete, va a dar una vuelta, o media vuelta, o una vuelta y media a la Luna. No lo tenían confirmado eso. Y luego de eso regresa a la Tierra. Puede que pase por encima del sitio y puede que tengan previsto tomar fotografías. No lo han dicho. Ahora, no va a haber ningún humano. No creo que tengan una cámara robótica adosada a una ventana buscando eso. Sinceramente no, porque no van a ser un agregado a esa cápsula en un momento en que están certificándola. Sinceramente yo no creo, para eso hay 2 orbitadores lunares en la Luna, ¿no? Uno de ellos es de la NASA. Ellos ya han compartido fotos de los lugares de las misiones. Y el otro también han mostrado cosas. Adrián Braga dice, la pregunta eran hechas a petición o muy cómodas. Bueno, en general creo que los grandes medios hacen sus deberes siempre, ¿no? Y por eso no le dan también la posibilidad siempre a todo el mundo, porque difunden lo que ellos también quieren que se difunda. Y bueno, está bien, es parte del juego. Me parece bárbaro. Leo las últimas preguntas. Se han planteado un rediseño esta nave, decía, no, bueno, eso ya la leí. ¿Qué pasa con esos likes, gente? Dice Walter Batista, gracias. Muchas gracias, vamos arriba. Preguntas más de lo mismo. Bueno, sí, lo interesante es que tenemos la misión de la Crew 4, que es el sábado de la semana próxima, que va a lanzar. Tienen que coordinar con ellos por el tema de que va a ser en el sitio de lanzamiento que está pegado a entonces no pueden estar haciendo las pruebas Dress Rehersal que piensan hacer y a su vez tener un lanzamiento allí, o sea, uno u otro. Y no van a trazar la Q3 porque ya la trazaron, inclusive ahora una vez, y creo que fue por esto. Marcos dice, China lanzó exitosamente su cohete Long March 3BE para colocar en órbita de transferencia geoestacionaria el satélite de comunicaciones ChinaSat 6D. Sí, creo que hubo 2 lanzamientos de China hoy. No los transmitimos porque lamentablemente no hay transmisiones oficiales de esos lanzamientos. Entonces no tiene sentido distraerlos a ustedes y tratar de transmitir una cosa que es posible que no la tengamos. Si quieren, los pocos que estamos acá, nos vamos un momento a Discord y seguimos charlando un poco mano a mano. Habilito el video allí en el canal TVcast y nos vemos. Rosa Sierra dice, dan sus explicaciones sobre las cuestiones que se preguntan, pero hay muchas cosas que son complejas y todo no es tan fácil como se parece. No, es que en realidad como le dicen ellos, este mega cohete lunar es gigantesco, ¿no? Es la primera vez que hacen una cosa de estas. Entonces, yo entiendo, digo, no es fácil esto, ni siquiera para la NASA. Es un desarrollo nuevo. Vamos a entendernos. Si no estuviera el desarrollo de SpaceX, uno puede decir que esto está bárbaro y que es una mega construcción de un mega cohete, lo cual es re complicado y sí, obviamente les puede llevar ese tiempo o más. ¿Por qué vienen los cuestionamientos en este momento de la gente o quizás de ustedes? Porque justamente SpaceX está demostrando de que los cohetes tradicionales, totalmente descartables, ya son cosa del pasado. Entonces, claro, deberían de considerar de no hacer esto y no seguir adelante, pero 4.100 millones de dólares, más todo lo que llevan invertido en el Artemis 2 y en el Artemis 3, es brutal la cantidad de dinero. Parar esa maquinaria así de golpe significa una catástrofe en la industria aeroespacial norteamericana. No lo pueden parar así nomás. Posiblemente después del lanzamiento del 3, si la Starship está andando, aparte tampoco pueden quedarse sin un backup, porque y si fracasa SpaceX, si SpaceX no puede colocar en órbita ese cohete, por más que todo parece indicar de que sí, pero también es un desarrollo nuevo con una tecnología totalmente nueva y tiene que hacerlo funcionar. Van a seguir demorando el programa lunar, van a seguir demorando el programa Artemis, esperando a ver si SpaceX le soluciona el problema. Yo creo que es razonable que sigan adelante a todo vapor, lo más rápido que puedan, minimizando riesgos, como decía Mike Serafín. Dice, lo que hacemos nosotros en realidad es tomar todos los riesgos, evaluarlos y administrarlos. Que es, en definitiva, de eso se trata un lanzamiento, de la administración de riesgos, porque riesgos hay en todos los lanzamientos. Gente, seguimos, no quiero distraerlos más, acá en YouTube. Gracias a todos los que han estado, un enorme abrazo a todos, a los moderadores, suscríbanse al canal, activen las notificaciones y nos vemos próximo. Nos vemos pronto. Recuerden, mañana tenemos el lanzamiento de SpaceX que quedó postergado. Es un poquito más temprano que en el día de hoy. Ahora después vamos a corregir la hora un poquito. Si ya sabían la hora de hoy en su hora local, recuerden que vamos a empezar 15 minutos antes de lo que estaba previsto, o por lo menos el día de hoy. Estoy en Discord, ya me conecto en Discord y si quieren charlamos unos 4 o 5 minutitos mano a mano allí en Discord. Un abrazo enorme, gracias. A ver, Adrián Braga, Daniel, la NASA tiene más de 50 años de experiencia y hasta hoy no ha innovado. En fin, me dice que Trabajador no fue una innovación y era reutilizable y ahí terminaron. Sí, te lo contesto en Discord, dale. Te lo contesto en Discord, así no lo sigo. Un abrazo enorme, gracias. Chau, chau.